In fact, Peter is still working. He's still at the Nuffield seeing NHS patients. But the reason why he's here today is to tell us about in September 2019, you set sail from London as part of Team Seattle crew taking part in the Clipper Round the World yacht race. So I looked this up actually on the website. If I can bring it up on my phone, I might need to take my. So it's So there's a wonderful bit of explanation. It says Mother Nature does not distinguish between female and male, professional or novice. There's nowhere to hide. If Mother Nature throws down the gauntlet, you must be ready to face the same challenges as the pro racer. Navigate the Atlantic trade winds and doldrums en route to South America. Enjoy the epic roaring 40s. Experience Indian Ocean sunsets. Face the mountainous seas of a mighty Pacific. And bond with an international crew, creating lifelong memories before returning victorious. And then it says, seize the moment, unleash the adventure. So I think what a wonderful introduction. So Peter, over to you to tell us more. What do I need to do? Oh, got it. Yeah, I understand. Got it. Right. Okay.
Mark, thank you very much. Good evening. Good introduction. Here's my introduction. Imagine if you can, not being those guys, because I can tell you, those guys are having the time of their life. I'd like you to imagine being the crew member who is tucked somewhere under that bit of decking in the middle there, just below the decking, in his bunk, wedged in a bunk which is at 40 degrees, so he's squashed against the hull of the boat, desperate to get to sleep. That bunk is unpredictably and constantly jumping and twisting and moving, lurching, and he is absolutely exhausted. He hasn't slept properly for 48 hours. And he hasn't been able to eat or drink properly for about 36 hours because of the nausea and vomiting of the torrential seasickness. The only silver lining is he's lying in his bunk, so he's flat, so he's feeling okay. But that kind of balloon quickly deflates because he then realizes, looking at his watch, that in less than an hour, he needs to be up there on the deck. And he's going to have to use his last ounce of energy to climb over the bunk, lower himself down onto this unsteady, unstable floor, and try and put all that gear on, knowing that as soon as he's upright, the nausea, the vomiting is all going to return. So imagine, if you can, back in the days when you were a sleep-deprived new parent, combine that with a violent tummy bug from food poisoning, sitting on a washing machine on a roller coaster, and you're getting pretty close. I don't know if anybody in the room has had a really strong goal, an aspiration, a dream that's been really powerful and strong for them. They've put a lot of time and effort and organization to make it happen. And when it happens, it bears absolutely no resemblance to your level of expectation. Because if you've been in that situation, I can feel your pain. because I was that crew member wedged into that bunk, feeling extremely sorry for myself. I realized at that moment that I had probably made one of the most ridiculous and expensive mistakes of my life in trying to think that the 3 to 5 years of planning that had gone on to me being part of the Clipper race was actually ever a good idea. So you may well be asking, how did an orthopaedic surgeon in landlocked York find himself in such a predicament? An orthopaedic surgeon who generally, thank you Mark for the compliments, has a reputation for being relatively careful, somewhat cautious, mild-mannered, reserved, certainly old enough to know better, in fact old enough to qualify for a Saga river cruise, never mind something like this. How on earth did I find myself in such a state? Well, things happen over time, and they often happen in nudges. I have no sailing experience of any significance. I was mentioning to some people before in the library that we've had a friend who had a boat off the south coast, and my wife and I had done some weekend sailing with them, pootling around to the Isle of Wight, and that was great. My father-in-law, some of you may remember or know David Belbin, retired GP from Escrick, and David is a very experienced sailor, day skipper, instructor, yacht master, and in fact sailed the Southern Ocean as part of one of the BT Challenge expeditions in the 90s. So I knew that sailing could be both an adventure and a hobby, but that was all it was really. Until one eventful and fateful morning in that well-renowned nautical city of Peterborough, with a long history of maritime culture. And it was this time of year, I was on the early morning East Coast train down to London to teach on a trauma course. It was dark, it was dismal, it was wet and wild and windy, a typical November morning. And we pulled into Peterborough station. And as I lifted my head from my coffee and my notes to look out of the window at the station, I saw something very similar to this. This huge yacht rising out of the surf with spray coming over the bow. And as the wind lashed the rain against my carriage window, I was on that boat. And it felt amazing. And I was hooked. It was, of course, a poster for the Clipper Round the World yacht race. And I just knew at that point that was something I was going to have to explore. It was an itch that I needed to scratch. Has anybody, and you've looked at the website, we have a few sailors I know in the room. Has anyone come across the Clipper race before? Yeah, so you're familiar with it? Anyone been on the Clipper race before? Well, you might want to at the end of this. Then again, you might not. So the Clipper race has been going for some years. It was born out of the ashes of the BT Round the World Global Challenge. Sir Robin Knox, the first person to sail single-handedly solo around the world without stopping back in 1969. He has been the figurehead of the Clipper organization. And around the time that I was looking at it, 11 yachts, all identical 70-foot yachts, skippered by a professional skipper and first mate, and crewed by complete amateurs. Those amateurs can range from people who may have their own boat and may be very, very experienced to somebody who has never set foot on a boat at all. Complete amateurs. In all other respects, the boats are identical, and they race around the globe a total of some 48,000 nautical miles, split up into several legs. And as a crew member, you can pick and choose whether you do the whole thing, whether you do one or two, how many legs and which legs you wish to do. And they run the event every 2 years. So they tend to leave end of August, beginning of September. It takes 11 months for the race to complete. They then refurbish the boats over the following year, and then they go again the year after for another 11 months. So having discovered this itch, I of course sent off for a brochure and a leaflet and a poster and some more brochures. And they suddenly started appearing around the house in places, you know, coffee tables and on the settee. And the term clipper was dropped into the conversation in the car over an evening meal, out with friends. Wouldn't it be great? It must be amazing. It would be fantastic. What an opportunity. Closely followed by, yes, but it's not for me. I mean, I couldn't possibly take the time off. I don't know how to sail. I wouldn't want to be away from the family, from my parents. And what about work? It's not for me. It's for other people. And this kind of conversation went on for a couple of months until my very Yorkshire wife, Nikki, finally said, will you either apply or shut up? Because I am sick to death of hearing about this ruddy clipper. So that was the permission I needed, I think, to fill in the form, go down for an interview, and lo and behold, I was accepted. And of course, the first question they ask is, well, what legs do you want to do then? What are you signing up for? I've never sailed an ocean. I've never seen a 70-foot yacht before. I have no idea. How am I supposed to decide it? The Pacific, the Atlantic. So I obviously gave the only answer you can possibly give as an orthopaedic surgeon in that situation. Well, I'll do the whole thing, obviously. If I'm going to prepare and take the time off and have all these conversations, then in for a penny, in for a pound. I'll do the whole thing. The race, as I say, runs every 2 years. And because of where the children were around school and education, university, that sort of, I said, well, I can't go for the next race. I'm going to go for the race after that. So it was 3, nearly 4 years in the distance. So I didn't really have to think about the consequences of what I'd taken on. Didn't certainly have to do any preparation. I could just bask in the glory amongst family and friends of my newfound fame of being a global adventurer and explorer without having stepped onto the boat at all. And that was very exciting. I love that part of my adventure. I could go out and tell tall stories about the adventure I was going to have in a few years' time. And that was all very, very exciting until, to take a nautical metaphor, until the plan hit the rocks in quite dramatic style. So about a year after I'd applied, this photograph on the right is taken on a beautiful sunny Sunday morning on the lower slopes of Ben Nevis. As Nikki and I, with a couple who were really close friends, had decided to do the national 3 peaks at a pace that befitted and respected our increasing maturity. So we were taking a week, we were going to stay in nice hotels and B&Bs, and we were going to take a week's holiday, but do the 3 national peaks. And we were an hour into our first peak, going up Ben Nevis. And Chris stopped and he said, oh, I'm going to need to take a bit. I said, I think I've had a bit too much Scottish black pudding and sausage, so I'm feeling a bit queasy, a bit lightheaded. So we stopped for a drink of water. He said, I think I sit down. I said, you're looking a bit pale, Chris. He said, yeah, I think we're going to. He said, I don't think I'm going to make it. Okay, Ben Nevis isn't going anywhere. Well, you know, we're on holiday. It's not a problem. And as I took his back sack off, his day sack, and he went to sit on a boulder, he just slumped into my arms. Eyes closed, not breathing, no pulse. We started CPR, which we continued. Within about 10 minutes, fortunately, a park ranger was passing. He assisted us. He radioed for the helicopter. We knew that Chris was probably dead. But what do? You can't stop. His wife was there. He was a friend. You carry on. 45 minutes we were performing CPR till the helicopter arrived. Paramedics were winched down and they took Chris away. And the following day, the 3 of us drove back to York with an empty seat in the car. I had to phone, because Tina was in such a state, I had to phone her 2 children from the hotel that night and let them know the sad news. We dropped Tina off at her daughter's because she obviously didn't want to go home. Dropped Tina off her daughter's, who was 7 months pregnant with their first grandchild. It was a sobering experience. But the interesting thing is that despite that being a clear example as to how fragile and unpredictable life can be and how we need to live life in the present, actually, I now look back and actually didn't change what I did, didn't change my behavior. I continued to work full time. I continued to work more hours than God sends. I still wasn't seeing my mum and dad enough or spending time with the kids. So it really, in reality, hadn't changed despite it being such a significant event. And then a year later, photograph on the left is my dad, taken a few years before this event I'm recalling. He loved the lakes. It was his spiritual home. And every year we would book 2 or 3 days as a kind of Father's Day present, and I would take him away for 2 or 3 days. He would pick the routes and I'd book the pub and we'd stay overnight and catch up and do some walking. And that's him approaching the summit of Blencathra. And a year almost to the month after Chris passed away, my dad was up in Grasmere with my sister and her husband celebrating my sister's 50th. And they'd been out for a short walk in the morning, stopped off for some lunch. And my dad said to Alan, my brother-in-law, he said, I must take you. I don't think I've ever taken you, but I must take you on my favourite walk in the whole lakes, just round the back of Grasmere. It is one of my favourite walks. And I said, are you sure? We've already had a walk this morning. He said, no, we must go for this walk. It's really important to me. So I don't know if any of you know the lakes, but at the back of Grasmere, just below Silver How, there's a couple of hours walk up to the top, and it's one of those classic lakeland walks where you're not out for very long. You don't even have to go very high, but you suddenly come up and you get this most amazing 360 panoramic view of Grasmere, Derwentwater, Windermere, the Langdales. It's breathtaking. So Alan recalls that they got up there, they'd stopped, they'd had a bit of water, and they just left to sort of meander their way down when my dad seemed to trip. And Alan just thought he would recover and find his footing, but he didn't. He just fell forward and was clearly dead before he hit the ground. And the mountain rescue was called, and he'd obviously had a massive heart attack. For both Chris and my dad, what a way to go. Yeah, I would take that. For my mum and my sister, sitting in the coffee shop on Grasmere, waiting for the boys to come home, it wasn't quite so good. And that turned our world upside down. Losing your father for most of us in such circumstances would, but particularly coming a year after Chris. Dealing with my own grief, sense of loss, the loss of what might have happened in the future, the loss of actually working so hard and not spending enough time with them in the past, supporting my mum, my sisters through their grief, and of course the children. It was the first major bereavement of their lives, and often for most children, the grandparents are, and it's a significant one. Grandparents are often a significant person in children's lives. And it made us a monumental change to how I live my life. It's what started me on the process to be working part-time. I knew that I needed to change my work-life balance. I wanted to spend more time with the people that mattered. And that's what moved me to where I do now, which is working in my NHS career and practices all based independently at the Nuffield, where I can work part-time. It also started me on the path of thinking slightly different about my career, because I still love my orthopaedic practice, replacing worn-out hips and knees. But my dad and Chris were both from the outside seemingly fit and well. They didn't smoke. They weren't, as you can see, overweight. They didn't have a particularly strong family history, but there was clearly a ticking time bomb inside them. And it started my interest in what is it about people that creates these conditions, chronic disease, and my interest in lifestyle medicine and the power of lifestyle change to improve, treat, and prevent chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease, and of course, bone and joint disease. So those two events have had a significant impact on my professional life and personal life. And as for Clipper, well, that was just off the agenda. How could I possibly now leave the family for 11 months? How could I possibly turn my back on the family in those situations. That was just, it was a nice idea, but it was just the wrong time, wrong place. It didn't help that Clipper was having its own significant events. 2013 race in Clipper, they had a man overboard. Crew member was retrieved and was well, survived. 2015, they had a significant head injury. Crew member died on board. Same race, same boat. Crew member overboard. Crew member was retrieved, was dead, unable to resuscitate. 2017 race, man overboard, body never retrieved. 3 races, 4 major incidents, 3 deaths. It was starting to dawn on me that there was a bit of a difference between having a jolly jaunt on the Solent and taking part in the Clipper. Some of the conversations were very different. And it was again my wife Nikki who started to have that conversation with me about, do you have to really say no to Clipper? Is there not some way that we can look at a halfway house? Are you not drifting into that all or nothing thinking, for which I have a habit? Is there not some way that we can look at doing things differently? And of course there was. I had to realize that the all or nothing thinking was just my cautious self trying to keep me comfortable in my comfort zone. And of course, as we all know, it's our discomfort zone where the adventure and opportunities really lie. So we sat down and we had some proper conversations, probably the first time we'd had a proper conversation about, why did I want to do the Clipper? What was I hoping to get out of it? Which bits of it really appealed to me? Did it have to be all or nothing? So I knew that I wanted to sail across an ocean. I knew I wanted to go to places that I hadn't seen. So I made the decision with Nikki that I would, and the family, after discussing it all, that I wanted to take part in the start from London. I want to be part of that razzmatazz, the excitement of the launch from St. Catherine's Dock. As you can see from the look on the faces of the boats, moments before we left St. Catherine's Dock, there wasn't much excitement there. It was slowly dawning on us what we had signed up for. That apprehension, that feeling in the pit of your stomach that there is no turning back now, and oh my God, the exhilaration of being part of the parade of sail under the Tower Bridge. I wanted to sail across the Atlantic, cross the equator. I would then come home in November. After that, I would spend Christmas with the family, New Year with the family. I'd touch base with work, excuse me, and then I would go back out to the Philippines, to China, rejoin the fleet. I would do the mighty North Pacific, stay on the boat at Seattle, which of course was our host port as I was on Team Seattle, and then stay on to go through the Panama Canal and finish in New York. The boat would continue across the North Atlantic, but Nikki and I would take a holiday in New York. We'd come home and be back in London in time to catch up with the family and then be down to London to see the boats come in. It was my Clipper. It was for the first time something that I could really engage with, felt really exciting, but also very manageable. And I was still there for the family in a way that was meaningful to them and to me. I was only doing 3 legs, but I was doing over 22,500 nautical miles, which is almost half the circumference, almost half the race, and is actually nearly the circumference of the globe anyway. So I was circumnavigating in a way. So that's what I set out to do. Let me just go back. So where were we on my journey before I got a bit distracted about what got me there? If I remember rightly, I was stuck in a bunk, feeling a bit sorry for myself and wondering what the hell I'd let myself in for. So where exactly were we when that happened? Well, we hadn't quite crossed the equator and got to Brazil. We weren't quite there yet. In fact, we hadn't quite got to Africa either. We were We were not very far from that number one, actually. We were in the English Channel, about 2.5 days out of London. Yeah, 2.5 days into my ocean traveling adventure. The only thing I knew is that, well, there's two things I knew. One, that once I got off that boat, I was never getting on another boat at all. But secondly, when we had our very short, brief stopover in Portimao for a few days before tackling the Atlantic, I would be on the next Jet2 flight back to Lisbon. Those two things were unequivocally factual. But of course, that didn't happen. What changed? Well, what changed was I had to do a lot of soul searching. I'll be in my depths. I had to do a lot of soul searching. I had to trust the fact that I had made this decision at the right time, at the right place. And why did I want to do that? Because I wanted to sail and I wanted to travel to new places and have an adventure. But I did generally want to test myself. I wanted to know whether I could do it. I wanted to know how far I could push myself. It helped, of course, that I couldn't get off the boat. It's amazing how resilient you can be when you don't have another option. But I had to realize that actually this is what I'd signed up for. This was part of the deal, was to go through this. It wasn't all going to be plain sailing, and it wouldn't be all fun if it was plain sailing. This was part of the deal. And actually that psychological shift, just that in itself made a big difference, knowing that this was part of the deal. Viktor Frankl said, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. It's how we perceive things. It's the framework that we look at it, the lens. And of course, we turned the corner out of the channel. We moved away from a headwind to a downwind. The boat leveled out. We got our sea legs and the sun came out. And suddenly everything seemed a little bit brighter. And we started getting into the routine a little bit more. And we started to be able to actually enjoy things and enjoy the journey. So it might be worth me at this point just giving you a bit of a tour. Would you like a tour of the home that we had? So this is Team Seattle, one of our 70-foot yachts, obviously 70 foot long. Obviously, that's why it's a 70-foot yacht, about 18.5 feet wide. And it looks pretty good, big when you see us there. But I can tell you now, by the time the front third is full of our 9 massive sails, and the back third is full of engine and helming, gearing, and food stores and everything else, there isn't an awful lot of living space. The mast is 100 feet tall. The sails are huge. The largest spinnaker is roughly the size of a tennis court. All of those sails are hanked on by hand, apart from the mainsail. But all of the 4 sails have to be hand hauled from the sail locker onto the deck and hand hanked onto the forestay, all winching by hand. That's the outside. Inside's cozy. The bunks, when you're really tired, it can be quite comfortable actually. But there's not an awful lot of living space, and you certainly get to know your fellow crew members pretty closely. The ensuite facilities, well, they are basic rather than luxurious, but they serve a function. The more observant amongst you will notice that there isn't actually a toilet seat. It's a store, health and safety, but that's a story perhaps for a bit later in the evening. But yes, there have been 1 or 2 traumatic accidents with people getting things caught in toilet seats. So all the toilet seats are removed. The galley and the saloon is the hub and the social hub of the boat, where the cooking takes place, where we all sit and eat, and if we want, when we're off watch, to converse. There's an unwritten rule amongst the clipper that if you were off watch and wanted to be sociable, you sat in the saloon and chatted. If you were on your bunk, even if you were awake, if you're on your bunk, you clearly needed your downtime. You needed some space. So unless somebody needed you for something, you were left well alone. It's that kind of unwritten rule. The food, if you can make it out, as you can see, was bland. Thank goodness for chili sauce and pepper. But it was a very carbohydrate dense, protein scarce diet that we were on. Fresh stuff lasted for 4 or 5 days, and then you were on the dried stuff. The watch systems, it varied between boats, but most boats had a 2-watch system. The crew numbers varied between 14, 16, maybe up to 18, 20, depending upon how popular that particular leg was. We had a 2-watch system, so you'd have half the crew resting and half the crew up on deck manning the sails and helming and sailing the boat. At any one time, one person from each watch would be on domestic duty, and it was their job to look after the crew, to do the cooking, the cleaning, to check any maintenance that needed doing. And also it was an opportunity when you were on domestic duty, you got a little bit more off-watch rest time than you did when on the rest of the rotate. So we all had to take our time in cooking the breakfast, doing the washing up, scrubbing the floors, and doing all of those duties. Cooking was interesting because, of course, the galley didn't normally look like that. It normally looked like that because everything was at a 30, 45 degree angle. And getting breakfast and cooking the overnight bread at night was also interesting because not only was it an angle, but it was dark apart from the red light. So that was an interesting experience, learning your domestic skills and putting them to the test. But we very quickly got into the typical sailing ocean going routine, which was effectively eat, sleep, sail, repeat. And this was another interesting lesson for me, I think, is that I learned that I needed to trust my gut instincts of the decisions I'd made when starting the clipper. But when we were sailing, when we were on watch, our job was to sail the boat as effectively, as quickly, as safely, and to perform as well as a crew as we could. Our job when we were off watch was simply to eat and to rest. We had no other job to do other than to eat and to sleep. And it dawned on me that actually that's probably pretty true in life. If we want to be really effective in our daytime performance, if we really want to be effective around the family, around our relationships, around work, then we need to make sure we eat and sleep properly and stop trying to eat whilst we're working and work while we're eating and thinking about work when we're sleeping. And the modern life just doesn't separate it. It was an important lesson for me that actually when you simplify life, it can be so much more straightforward and so much more content. Sometimes being complicated just means it's complicated, not necessarily better. We got a chance to see the great wildlife that was out there, some familiar dolphins, porpoises, some unfamiliar wildlife. This is the Atlantic cod, the flying fish, huge fins that allow them to glide for up to 200 yards at speeds of 35 miles an hour. At times that was quicker than the boat was traveling. And the sight of a pod of dolphins or a shoal of flying fish leaping across in front of the bow was absolutely breathtaking. Flying fish can only glide in a straight line. So providing they're in front or behind the boat, it's fine. If they're in line with the boat, then you have to duck out the way because they tend to land on the deck. And if you don't pick the ones up off the deck and they surreptitiously fall down the gangway and get wedged behind the bin, they don't smell very nice after 2 or 3 days, I can tell you that. Nighttime sailing was one of the highlights for me. Sailing with white sails, spinnaker underneath a moonlit sky was just the height of the whole experience. But in some ways, what I failed to realize, and we get this a little bit in North Yorkshire when we're out in the countryside at night, but when there's no moon, actually the depth and density of the stars is you can't even see the normal constellations. It's impossible to make out the Plough and Gemini, even if you know where you're looking, because the rest of the stars are just so bright. It was breathtaking. And of course, you then out in the ocean get this mirroring effect of the algae and the phosphorescence and the bioluminescence coming up in the wake after, almost reflecting the stars that are in the sky. It was just surreal. It was a really, really the best part of the trip. Of course, nighttime was a time of contrast. It could very quickly all go pear-shaped at night. And when it did, it was pretty chaotic. And we might touch on that in a few moments. The other thing that came with sailing at night are the sunrises. We're used to seeing impressive sunsets at home or on holiday in the Med. But I don't think many of us get the opportunity on a regular basis to see the sunrise, to go from dark to that twinge of grey in the east, to that little bit of yellow and orange as the sun rises. And when you are tired and you've been sailing the boat overnight, to see that light come up is absolutely inspirational. And I can understand why many people and a lot of our ancestors saw sunrise as such a spiritual occasion, because you do absolutely feel as though it's a brand new day, that the slate has been swiped clean. And it didn't matter how rubbish we were sailing the boat yesterday. This is a new day. This is a new day. And it reminded me that life is what we make it. We are not, our future is not determined by our past. We can make a different choice because every day is a new day. I wasn't the official medic because I wasn't around the worlder, but I was the only qualified doctor. And as an orthopaedic surgeon, I quickly became the go-to person for the, oh, you can't see it very well there, but these are the boat kisses that we often call them, the deep bruising that you get when you hit an immovable object at speed. We had a number of head injuries. We had a number of burns where people weren't following the regulations and wearing boots and long trousers when trying to make a coffee. Hot water and unstable environments is not a great mix. And at times it felt like being an A&E SHO again. On more than one occasion, I would get out of my bunk before going on watch, go and grab something, hopefully grab something to eat and drink, only to find 3 or 4 of my crew members lined up in the saloon like an outpatient department, waiting for me to change their dressing. Also, can you just have a look at my shoulder? I've got a bit of sore. But things like tendonitis were also really common. And that was fine. It was great for me to be able to contribute in that way. Shortly after passing Cape Verde, we hit the doldrums and we came to a rounding stop. Water everywhere, as they say, not a drop to drink. We had water everywhere, clear blue skies, no land in sight, no boats in sight for days on end, and no wind. We'd been left London 4 weeks ago. We felt as though we had been on that boat forever, yet we still weren't even halfway to Uruguay. And we were going nowhere. And at times it felt as though we were going backwards. And for a lot of the crew, this was another really, really dark time. Frustration, the lack of movement, the accumulation of sleep deprivation, poor diet, and missing home, whatever it might be, fuses began to get a little bit short. And the little seemingly inconsequential things that hadn't really mattered now started to take on a much greater proportion. And those of us that had a little bit more life experience on board had to try and pull things together and recognize that this was an opportunity for us to find some purpose. We couldn't do anything about the lack of wind. The wind would come when the wind came, but actually it was a great opportunity for us to do some maintenance, do some repairs, look after the boat, and actually look after ourselves, take a bit of downtime, because when the winds came, we would be back on it full time again. Another important lesson for life, I think, which is savor those moments when you're forced to take a bit of a back step and not to push too hard. And the winds did come eventually, and very quickly we then tipped over from the northern into the southern hemisphere and crossed the equator. We did that overnight, and the next morning, as is the tradition, those unworthy Hollywags, that is the sailors who have yet to sail across the equator, had to present themselves at the court of King Neptune and take whatever forfeit or penalty he or she saw fit. That was normally a dousing of leftover porridge, pasta, and a bit of macerated flying fish. And then you became a shellback. You became an adored member, son of Neptune, and you were free to roam the oceans. Tradition has it that we normally have to have a virgin sacrifice. We didn't have any virgins. They're hard to find on most clipper boats. But we did have two very mad and very fetching Canadians who were certainly virgin on the ridiculous in their outfits. And we celebrated in true clipper style with homemade chocolate cake, squirty cream, and a bowl of cheese and onion crisps. We knew how to have a good time. And once again, it just proves that life doesn't need to be complicated to be content. The Southern Atlantic brought huge contrasts. We had great champagne sailing, and then we had heavy squalls that would sweep in, high winds, volatile direction, huge rain, that you would then suddenly have to gear the boat up for, and often do that very quickly. And that was fine during the day. You often, but not always, had time to prepare. But it was not always that easy at night. And it was quite windy on this particular night. You can see we're well heeled over, the sail is full, but it was a steady wind as I came off watch about 2 o'clock, went down and got into my bunk. And by then I had no trouble closing my eyes and getting some sleep. In fact, the boat had become quite soothing by that stage. About an hour later, we could tell that something wasn't right. We could tell because the boat was heavily heeled over. We'd picked up speed. We were bouncing through the waves. There was lots of stuff going up on deck, winching and people running down to get sails hatches open. A squall had clearly come in. It was a big one. It had come in quicker than expected. Maybe the night time they hadn't picked it up, and we had too much sail up. We were overpowered, and the helm couldn't control the boat. And then things changed again. The tone of the shouting changed, the urgency changed, and we heard that phrase that nobody wants to hear when they're out on a boat: man overboard, man overboard, man overboard. Clipper takes safety and the safety rules really seriously. At every training, we practice man overboard. Every time we meet before a leg, we practice man overboard. Before the race starts, every boat has to practice a man overboard. But once the race starts, we don't practice man overboards. We don't practice at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a squall doing a man overboard. This clearly wasn't a drill. But we practice it relentlessly so that we all knew what we had to do. And every boat does this exactly the same. So even if the Clipper's skipper is off watch, even if you swap crews around, everybody does this exactly the same. And to give you a taste of what we have to do, he says, this is the live footage from that 2013 man overboard that I mentioned earlier. Down below, the priorities are to get somebody onto the radio, alert other shipping in the area, mark the coordinates so we know where the person went overboard so we can get back. And my role as off watch was also to prepare a bunk, get some blankets, get the medical kit out, and be ready. Up on deck, take a halyard that normally hoists the sail, attach it to a harness around another crew member, and that crew member goes into the water with a spare halyard to attach onto the other crew member. Both crew members are then winched back on board. And using one of the sail bags, the crew member is then, as gently as possible, taken down below for assessment and any attention that they might need. That was in the day. We were 3 o'clock in the morning. Heavy winds, big seas. And then we heard that the person who'd gone overboard was our skipper. Now, obviously, it doesn't matter who goes overboard in this one sense, but in another sense, this was a whole different ball game. The first mate was on the helm. Huge responsibility. There was no point us down below racing up there. It would have been, no one could see what we were doing. We would just get in the way. We just had to sit below, do what we needed to do, and wait. We retrieved the skipper within 20 minutes, which under the conditions is an absolutely incredible performance by the crew that were on the deck, and the first mate in particular. The crew member in the 2015 race that was retrieved but was dead by the time they got her back on board had been in the water for 30 minutes. If we had taken 10 to 15 minutes longer, then our skipper may not have survived. He fortunately was okay-ish. He'd had a head injury. He was mildly concussed. He was mildly hypothermic. He had a cut above his eyebrow that was bleeding, and he'd clearly swallowed a lot of water. In the next 24, 48 hours, we had to monitor his breathing quite carefully. We had oxygen on board, and we had to support him with oxygen, some salbutamol, sort out his head wound, slowly warm him up, and slowly he began to improve and to recover. But it was a tense few moments. And actually for the crew, what was worse almost was once he was safe, once we knew he was on board and once we knew he was going to be okay. I spent the next 24, 48 hours suddenly doing my ITU experience, which I'd never done before, so that was never too old to learn. But for the rest of the crew and for me and myself and for everybody, we had all of that adrenaline. We went into man overboard mode. We did what we needed to do. And then, of course, you start saying, what if it hadn't happened? You just leave totally exhausted. And the first mate in particular was emotionally just wrung out. But of course, we still had 12 days to go across the South Atlantic. We didn't have much time for, self-pity, and we had to do some of it, and we had to try and bring the crew together. I'd got to know the skipper quite well, and he'd confided in me a couple of weeks out of leaving London that whilst he was a very experienced ocean sailing skipper, what I hadn't realised, and he shared with me, was that he had very little leadership experience. He'd never led a team in his career. He certainly hadn't led a team of fee-paying guests and volunteers in a competitive environment. And he was struggling with how to motivate and how to bring the team together. And after this experience, it took him a couple of days to physically recover. It took him far longer to psychologically begin to come to terms with his feelings, the feelings of embarrassment, feelings of guilt, the feelings of anxiety about what would that mean? What would it have meant if I hadn't, for the crew that I'm supposed to be responsible for? What does it mean for me and my career, my clipper career, my credibility as a sailor? All of this stuff was going on in his head. And we still needed to get across the rest of the Southern Atlantic. But the team dynamics was fantastic, and we pulled together really, really well. And the skipper, came through that and we got through the rest of the trip. We had some horrendous storms that, in comparison, we kind of breezed through, given the experiences that we had. But just outside of Punta del Este, we came through close to a hurricane force storm that we sailed through, and we did eventually, 12 days later, arrive at Punta del Este in Uruguay. Huge sense of relief, huge sense of pride of what we've achieved and the challenges that we've overcome. We'd all lost a little bit of weight, and a huge smile on our faces, and particularly to have loved ones on the quayside waiting to see us home. That was the end of my Atlantic adventure. I had anticipated that there would be more to come. One of the hardest things, I knew that my decision to go back home for Christmas, New Year, and rejoin the fleet the following year in the March, April, and do my 2 legs of lane was the right thing to do. But we'd elected to stay in Punta del Este, help clean the boat, turn it round, integrate the new crew that had arrived, and I wanted to see the boat off. But that was really hard. Watching the boat leave Punta del Este on its journey to South Africa after what we'd been through and not being part of the crew, that was really hard. Of course, the rest of my Clipper adventure didn't quite go off according to plan. COVID had other plans, and all of us probably in this room had plans that were sideswiped by the pandemic that came in 2020. But at least I was fortunate enough to have taken part in this part of the Clipper adventure. And I will be immensely grateful for that. I do have a couple of slides that kind of summarize my personal insights and learning, but I'm happy if we have time to open the floor for some questions, if that's all right, Mark, at this point, if you're happy with that. Whatever you prefer, I can finish that way first, yeah? And then you can ask, yeah. So my personal insights, life is short and fragile. We've certainly learned that. It is very unpredictable. And yet it is also an all-you-can-eat, expansive buffet of fantastic opportunities and experiences just lying out there waiting for you to have the courage of your convictions to dive in and take a bite. Life is what we make of it. Every day is a new day, and we set our sails. We determine the direction that our boat's going, wherever the wind and the waves may be throwing at us. But so often we need to get out of our own way. So often we need to stop telling us the stories that hold us back. Life is fulfilling when it's simple and in flow. We can make life complicated and we can make it busy, but all that does is make it complicated and make it busy. It doesn't make it any happier. On the boat, our mantra was eat, sleep, sail, repeat. And I'd like to think since coming back, our land mantra is now love, laugh, live, repeat. I've certainly learned that you're never too old to learn. Whether that's, I thought I knew how to tie knots as a surgeon, but clearly not all of them. We're never too old to learn. Our dreams do not chase us. We have to chase them. And we can be resolute in chasing our dreams, but we need to be flexible in how we get there. I learned a lot about leadership, particularly leadership of myself, but also building on the leadership work that I did throughout the NHS, how to lead others effectively. But most of all, I learned that it's all about people. What made it for me was the people that I was with on that boat, was the team and the people who are now lifelong friends. What made it for me was the people who weren't on the boat, the people that I left behind. That's when you start to realize who and what is important, the people that I left behind. We had a system where we could write emails, and every 48 hours or so, the emails would be uploaded onto the satellite, and then the next 24 hours downloaded onto a server, and whoever would get it the day after that, and then they'd write an email, and 48 hours after that it would be uploaded to the satellite, and next time we passed under the satellite it would be downloaded. It was like going back in time and writing a letter and posting it, knowing that somebody would read it, and 4 or 5 days later another letter would come back that you would read, and there was something really beautiful about that type of communication. So I learned that people really matter most of all. And I leave you with my favorite quote, Mark Twain: life is short, break the rules, forgive quickly, kiss slowly, love truly, laugh uncontrollably, and never regret anything that makes you smile. 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do, not the things that you did. So throw off the bow lines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails. And I hope you've been inspired to find your clipper, your inner adventure, to explore, to dream, and to discover. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. So in a few minutes, I'm going to ask Robert to a vote of thanks. But before that, I'd like to take some questions at all, if anyone.
Chris?
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, lovely. And some interesting things to think about. 2 questions. One challenging. One easy. You make the point that people have been very keen on safety. They're very careless about losing people overboard. They have had a terrible record compared with other boats and other races. So I'd like to do some comments on that. Where was the skipper's tether? And the second thing, which is easy, which luxury do you think?
Which what, sorry?
Which luxury did you take?
Which luxury did I take? So I'll do it the easy one first. It's hard to nail it down to one, but I think for me the one piece of kit that I took, technical kit if you like, was a iPad that allowed me to email, listen to music, and read books, and take some downtime. And I uploaded that, and that, together with a battery charger, was the thing that I think kept me sane. From a luxury point of view, I had a couple of pairs of thick bamboo socks that I saved only to wear in my sleeping bag at night. They weren't worn during the day. They were always kept dry, and they were my little bit of luxury to put on my feet when I got back into my bunk. So those were the luxury items, and you are absolutely right. And I make the point deliberately in my talk about those incidents that happened, and obviously with our race in 2019, that was 1, 2, 3, 4 consecutive races when there were man overboard. And the reality is, for at least, I can't say for sure about all of them, but for 2 of those man overboards, then the crew members were not clipped on. And whilst there is no doubt that Clipper is not perfect, there is also no doubt that if you don't follow the guidelines, and if you don't as an individual take responsibility for your personal safety, there is a cutoff between what is organizational safety responsibility and what's personal safety responsibility. And 2 of those person overboards, were not clipped on. Now, they were, of course, in freak weathers, and talk about freak waves and stuff, but they're out in the middle of the ocean. It's unpredictable circumstances. So yes, and I'm not sure that's answered your question, but I think that there is a balance between personal responsibility and corporate responsibility. Could Clipper do more? Possibly. Could those individuals have done more? Possibly.
Right.
There's one. Sorry, yes. Yeah.
Yes, great. Yeah.
My first question has already been answered. Why was the skipper clipped on? I'm talking from experience. of sailing very carefully around the Mediterranean with somewhere to go each night and a nice meal. And I get anxious enough about that. So what you've done and described, I am never going to do that. But I wondered what your skipper's alcohol rule is.
Skipper's alcohol rule.
Yeah.
The skipper's alcohol rule was absolutely unequivocal. There was no alcohol on board at all. The only time I saw that rule broken was when we went down to see the boats return to London, because this edition that I was on finally completed earlier this year. The boats came back to London in July, and once the boats were moored up, we were all on the boat having a drink. But once there was no alcohol on board at all in any way, shape or form.
That might be another advantage of sailing in the Mediterranean.
Right.
I would probably agree. I would probably agree.
Yes, thank you, yeah.
How important was the racing element to the crew versus the participation?
So one of the interesting things, of course, is that Clipper attracts all sorts of people for all sorts of different reasons. And for some people, it is a competitive race. For some people, it's an opportunity to sail an ocean, and they just want to sail the ocean. For some people, it's a competitive race until they get on the boat and sail an ocean, and then think, oh my God, this is all a bit too hard work. I think I'll just sit back and each crew had a mix of individuals. And I think that was one of the challenges, was as somebody who is naturally, my wife keeps asking me, people say, are you competitive? I say, I'm not competitive. And my wife digs me in the ribs. It says, of course you're bloody competitive. You don't even let the kids win at Monopoly. You know, I mean, that must be the definition of competitive. So for me, competitive was not about winning. What I wanted was to make sure that we competed well with ourselves, that we sailed the boat well, that each time when we changed the sail, we did it more quickly, more swiftly, with more organization than the time before. But there were people amongst the crew who were last to go up on deck on watch, were the first one to nip down after an hour and go to the loo, stop and have a coffee and drift back up, and were the first one to go. Yeah, there were people like that. And at the end of the day, everybody on board was a fee-paying guest. They had bought a ferry ticket from London to Uruguay, courtesy of Clipper Trading. And some people chose to use it as an exciting adventure, and some people chose to use it as a ferry to a degree. So managing that within the team dynamics was an interesting experience. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Well, that's good.
Would you do it again?
Good question. Well, of course, Clipper still have my money for the 2 legs that I didn't do. So the honest answer to that is yes. I have deferred my place. Timing is not right for me. I've deferred my place potentially to not next year's race, but 2025. Negotiations are currently underway at home as to whether that involves the legs that I didn't do. We could just add 1 or 2 others in just to make it a bit more worthwhile. But that's an ongoing negotiation, so I'll have to keep you posted on that. But yes, I would. That itch hasn't yet been fully scratched.
Sarah.
So
You said obviously that the team was really important. So did they sort of select teams from everyone and look at who would get on well together, or how did they select the crews?
So they have a little bit of a kind of algorithm depending on who applies. They try and make the teams as well balanced as possible. So they try and make sure there's a relatively even distribution across the teams of ages, male and female, the number of people who are doing a circumnavigation around the world, the number of people who are just doing individual legs. They obviously have to make sure there's enough people on each boat for each leg to function, but not too many to make it too crowded. They ideally want somebody with some degree of medical experience, somebody who at least has you know, as a joiner or a carpenter or as an engineer or as a plumber or a sparky or whatever it might. So if there's people with particular skills, they will try and evenly distribute them amongst the teams as much as possible. There's an element of, I was on Team Seattle, so we had a lot of North Americans, particularly from the East Coast. The Chinese boats had a lot of Chinese because they wanted to be on the boat that was affiliated with their home country and home port. So Clipper do what they can to try and make the teams as equal as possible, but how those teams function and is often down to the teams and to the Clipper and to the skipper and the kind of ethos that they have. So decisions like, who does the helming? Is it just the skipper and the first mate that does the helming? Because if that's the case, the chances are you're more likely to go in a straight line rather than a nice wiggly line, and therefore more likely to be successful in the race. But of course, if you've paid a big chunk of money for a Clipper experience, you probably want to have some playing on the helm. So those were conversations that were happening on different boats. What do we do about people who aren't very good at helming but want to be better? How do we give them an experience without making sure we're at the back of the fleet? So those were conversations that happen all the time. Yeah.
Right, final question, Nick. And then
Thank you very much. Your ocean looks reassuringly empty.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of traffic in that ocean. Well, how do you deal with the problem of possible collision risks?
So you'd be surprised how little traffic there is actually. Obviously, the English Channel is like the M25, and there are certain areas where there's a lot of commercial traffic, but there were days and days on end when we did not see another boat at all. But we are well equipped with radar, GPS, and obviously both private and commercial boats all have GPS signals and both receivers and transponders. So you are able to pick those up on the radar and the navigation. But you have to have somebody. Whenever we had somebody on the helm, we also always had a helm watch, the helm's responsibility was to steer the course. And the helm watch's responsibility was to keep lookout to make sure the helm wasn't falling asleep and drifting off course. And then you had somebody who would normally down the navigation center as well.
well, thank you very much. I'm glad I'm on solid ground here. I'm going to hand over to Robert now to do a vote of thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been here, Peter. You have just the opportunity. Those of us who want to generally call mid-Christ, men, do it in different ways. My ocean-going experiences are limited to the inspiration I had. Reading Eric Newby's book, The Last Grain Race, then there was the ton grain boat with 10 steel masts and 4 sails on each mast. All sail on in the 40s, sailing towards Australia, way beyond and below Cape Hope, and then continuing across the South Pacific in the same vein, 25 miles an hour, 24 hours a day, waves 300 yards apart. I'm very inspired, but it's not so much just the technical side. You know the business about the thinking orthopaedic side.
Very dangerous.
I'm inspired by your thoughts and your philosophy. I'd like to thank you so much on behalf of the society for opening a window into our limited experience. We're not all going to go on, but we've really enjoyed being on Clipper tonight. Thank you so much.